Was this comic written just for me? Moon Knight number 188. So I sort of skimmed some of the reviews and some of the videos that people put out about this comic. And I did that, unfortunately, before I read it, kind of by accident. So I went into this expecting to not like it. And I started off, read the first couple pages, I didn't like it. And then by the end of it, I ended up really liking it. So this time I got the lenticular cover. And maybe it'll come through better on the GoPro, but I can only see the classic cover. I can't really see... I mean, yeah, you can just do this. But the only lenticular covers that I have liked are ones that are an actual appropriate reference to the character's history. The Iron Fist number 73, which was a reference to the debut of Sabretooth. Like, that was cool. But some of the lenticular covers that they've had just made no sense. But this one, I mean, there aren't very many classic Moon Knight covers, but I guess this is one of them. The one where, whatever this dude's name is about to smash Moon Knight. The reference doesn't seem to be arbitrary. It seems like they chose it on purpose. I actually happen to have the original one, because I've been going on this kick recently where I've just been buying random old comics just to see how a single issue back then compares to a single issue now. When you do that, when you compare these two, this one isn't as good, because this one, which is a double-sized issue back in the day, told a complete story, whereas this one's only telling about half a story. But they are both telling a similar story. They're both telling about the rise of sort of an anti-Moon Knight. In this one, it's a Vietnam soldier with PTSD who, upon hearing about Moon Knight, decides to become a corrupt version of him. So he ends up using his physical prowess and his political connections to become a candidate for mayor, and nearly succeeds in imposing his psychotic will on the city, but luckily stopped by Moon Knight. This one, and the big complaint about this issue, and it's an understandable one, and I think it's a legitimate one, is that Moon Knight is basically not in this issue. The character makes a very brief appearance, but it turns out it's not really him. On its own, though, this issue is very interesting. So I've gotten a lot of new subscribers recently. The big reason for that is because Englentine at I Love Comics featured my video on his channel, which I'm really grateful for. Thank you. And the video I chose to do was one that's a little bit different from what I usually do. It's talking about how basically modern-day Marvel, SJW Marvel, whatever you want to call it, how it doesn't create stories to last, and it doesn't create stories that are based on any kind of history or any kind of universal human experience. So let's turn to the back here. So I don't know who the writer is, Max Bemis. The name sounds vaguely familiar, but I don't know what else he's done, and I don't know who Jason Burrows is. But here's what he has to say. Anyone who treats a superhero comic as an easy paycheck needs to check themselves and realize why they are our most prevalent modern myths. Like, a lot of writers will say that comic books are modern myths, but I get the feeling a lot of them don't mean that. The only one that I believe, like genuinely believe, knows that is Grant Morrison, because he does that almost every superhero comic he does this kind of stuff. But Max Bemis does use this issue as a way to make Mark Spector's struggle more primal, more mythical in nature than just simply a guy who is crazy. So, of course, and as we see here, Moon Knight was given a second chance at life by the Egyptian moon god Khonshu. I've never really been into Moon Knight. I mean, I've read a couple issues that he did. I think I've actually read all of Bendis and Maleev's Moon Knight series that came out a few years ago. I actually remember liking that one. But the character himself, I mean, conceptually he's pretty simple. You know, it's basically what if Batman was completely crazy. When you actually get into the details, it's kind of weird. It's like there's been I think there's been more than one Moon Knight, plus Mark Spector himself has multiple personality disorders, so different people, different personalities have been Moon Knight at different times. Sometimes he has superpowers, sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes it seems like he's actually crazy. Sometimes it seems like he's just faking it. So there's just a lot about the character that's just kind of weird to me. This issue, like I said, much like the issue that the cover was referencing, this one's all about creating an anti-Moon Knight. So I didn't read any of Jeff Lemire's run before this. I read one issue, and I thought it was just really, really trippy and didn't understand it, and didn't feel compelled to read anything else that he did on Moon Knight. So I don't know if any of this setup is from that run or not. But basically, you have this psychiatrist who is treating a patient that while he was in the army, he killed a bunch of people by burning them alive. And so she's trying to figure out how best to treat his psychosis. And I guess at some point she also treated Moon Knight. And she keeps thinking back to Mark Spector as a way to try to treat this guy. I don't know why they spent 2 pages on this. That didn't need to happen. That was dumb. Did they actually get Bill Sienkiewicz to do the cover? Oh, wow. That's cool. Anyway, this comic, it does kind of drag, because like a lot of this stuff here isn't really necessary. They could have shortened her whole story. So basically, her big plan to try to save this guy is to get him to redirect his psychosis onto something positive. So she knows that he's obsessed with fire. And so she thinks, well, fire doesn't have to be bad. It can be, fire is as necessary as it can be destructive. So she starts trying to get him to think about fire in a positive way, in a creative way. So basically, she starts thinking more and more about Mark Spector, about Moon Knight, and she thinks about how he was able to use a newfound faith in the Egyptian god Khonshu to become a positive force in the world. So she thinks maybe she can do something similar with this guy who's only known as Patient 86. He joined the army under a false name, which I don't really know how you do that in current year, but whatever. So nobody actually knows who he is. They just know that he had a traumatic childhood, and then when he was in the army, they apparently hazed him. It's a little bit murky about what actually happened, but something bad happened to him when he was in the army, and he ended up setting a bunch of people on fire. So she's trying to think, how can I make this work for him? And so she takes inspiration from Egyptian mythology. So I actually had to do a little bit of research for this review, because I don't really know that much about Egyptian mythology. I didn't even... I think the first time... I never even heard of Khonshu outside of the Moon Knight books. So I thought that they were kind of overselling Khonshu in this book, just to make him, build him up a little bit. But it turns out that they really weren't, at least not according to the rather cursory amount of research that I did in order to film this video. She says, and I'll just read this whole thing. So, Khonshu, the skeleton dude, is apparently the son, sort of Amun-Ra, the creator/sun god. And so she's talking about the dichotomy between them. And as she points out, some of this is factual, and some of this is just a Freudian interpretation. And I kind of hate the Freudian interpretation of anything, because it basically all boils down to, oh, it's about sex and femininity and masculinity. It's like, yes, of course it is, but Freudian mythology or Freudian interpretation tends to take this sort of above them attitude where it just seems like, you know, what were they really getting at, rather than just trying to understand what the people who believed in this stuff would have believed and why they believed it at the time. I'm willing to bet that there's more to it in her interpretation of this, but I'll just read it. So she says, Amun-Ra represented the burning, blazing emblem of masculine virility that is the sun. In many cultures, the sun stands for the sovereignty of masculinity, logic, and raw power. But in the New Kingdom of Egyptian lore, it was his adopted son who was described as greatest god of the great gods. Khonshu of the moon, a universal symbol for the redemptive power of insubordination, femininity, and sensitivity. See, that just sounds stupid. He was the moon god. You don't have to look more into it than that. The Ra's of this world resent becoming passé. It makes them angry, and they burn harder despite their own impotence. See, once again, you're reading more into it than they would have read into it. Established society can't accept change, can't accept that the old ways don't work anymore. Talking to patient 86, she says, something happened to you when you were young, dropped you into a sea of lost children. I believe what you're hiding from yourself was most likely some form of abuse. Reach back for me as far as you can. Does that idea spark anything for you? Something that lines up with the incident in the army? And he thinks that she's on the right track. And then she gives him a bunch of books about Egypt. So just like the character in this issue, he sort of becomes obsessed with Moon Knight, and he becomes obsessed with the idea of becoming like Moon Knight. This is the only appearance that Moon Knight makes in costume, and it turns out that it's not really Moon Knight, it's Patient 86 in a dream sequence of hers. So she advises him to get back to what he was, to their therapy, and then he says, I know who I am. And so now he seems like a changed person, that the myth of Amun-Ra and Khonshu have really, really affected him. And then one of the guys that Patient 86 just happened to serve with, she meets him in the army hospital, and he tells her that the way that they were hazing him, the way that they were basically assaulting him, there was no way he could have started that fire. So how did he do it? And so she gets a text and to go back to the asylum, and it turns out that he's gone crazy. He has gone completely off the deep end. So she hopes that he's been taken in by the idea of Khonshu, but it turns out that he wasn't. He was more struck by the idea of Amun-Ra. And so it turns out that he's either a mutant or an inhuman or a weird science experiment gone wrong or something, but whatever he is, he has the power to light himself on fire. So he leaves her to burn to death, and somehow in her trauma, she is able to come to this realization that, yeah, he's always had these powers, and he's always suppressed the memory of it. But now that she's helped him to unlock those memories, he now thinks of himself as a god, and he's going to subjugate Khonshu, which is Moon Knight, in order to begin his work of remaking the world, apparently. In Grant Morrison's Seven Soldiers of Victory, the one that was simultaneously the most confusing, but also the sort of deepest and I would argue the best one, was the Mr. Miracle series, the Shiloh Norman series. And in that one, the drama that used to play out between New Genesis and Apocalypse is now playing out again on the streets of, I think, Chicago, wherever it took place. You had homeless bums going up against pimps and drug dealers, and it was the same dynamic as Apocalypse and New Genesis, but it was different people. And the point of that miniseries was that the life of, or these sort of mythological elements, they don't just play out in dead stories, and they don't play out in 1,000-year-old cultures, and they don't play out on tops of mountains or out beyond the firmament. They play out in each person, each individual, and between people. And like I said, I'm not overly familiar with stories about Moon Knight, but the fact that he got his power from an Egyptian god sets up the moments really well. And so this issue is all about setting up a character that because of the power of myth becomes something far more powerful than he was before. Unfortunately, it doesn't go very well, but the point is that both Patient 86 and Mark Spector were influenced by these ancient dynamics that are older than the human race, older than time itself. I mean, the story of Amun-Ra is the story of the sun. Every single day, that mythological story plays out. Likewise, the story of Khonshu plays out every night, every 28 days through the cycle of the moon. And those have been going on much longer than humans have been around, but these things still affect us. And if I'm reading this issue correctly, this story going forward is going to be about how these sort of bigger ideas still have an effect on people. So yeah, this is the kind of stuff that I've been saying that Marvel, and really all comic book writers, but Marvel especially, I think is plagued by this, that it needs to be doing. I mean, you can see right here that I don't know if this is going to be his costume later, but the Falcon head with this disc on top, that's the look of Amun-Ra. So I don't. It does suck that Moon Knight is not in this. I mean, it's not too much to expect that a book called Moon Knight is going to have Moon Knight in it. And there is filler here. There is stuff they could have cut out. So this issue isn't perfect, but this is the kind of stuff that Marvel needs to be doing more of. And it's a shame because I don't think this book is going to get a lot of traction. But I'm going to be reading the next issue to see if it continues with this sort of mythological motif. So tell me what you thought of it. Tell me if you read this. Tell me if you agree, disagree with me. In any case, this is Unranked Chevron signing off.